So this video is about psychological or cognitive continuity. And often I kind of go through bodies of text or information in general, which is super rich, super useful. There's decades worth of knowledge being accumulated in a mind or in a brain, and you just kind of wonder, like, that kind of information should be preserved in a very rich format, as opposed to somebody actually leaving their legacy behind in terms of books or any other form at that, like recorded transmission, like audio, video, or something. So I kind of started making or writing a short story about this, where I kind of conceptualized conscious entities and being able to kind of interact with those entities in a controlled format. So I kind of started doing something like that last year or the year before, and I put that story kind of out there on Wattpad. It's kind of like a crowdsourced storytelling platform. But obviously it's not a novel idea. Many individuals have been thinking about this. I don't know for how long. I've at least witnessed Steve Jobs talking about it when he said, quote, I have this on my screen, I would trade all of my technology for an afternoon with God. That's Steve Jobs saying that. Like, all of Steve Jobs' technology, everything that he has pioneered across the various, across his career with the various companies, he traded with just one afternoon with Socrates. What if you didn't have to? What if you could just interact with Socrates, and whether in a mind file or some replica of Socrates' or anyone else's consciousness? I've also heard John Archibald Wheeler, who was a famous and he had an knack for finding and training individuals like Richard Feynman. Archibald Wheeler also said that he was very keen on kind of going back, and his idea was to kind of measure the acoustic bouncing of the stones where the conversations between the various Greek philosophers occurred. So that's not to say, it's not a core focus on the Greek philosophy or philosophers, but it's just to suggest, like, so many individuals have such a rich acquisition, so much information and knowledge that they've acquired over a time frame that there's got to be a way to interact with that consciousness directly. The direct representation that I've seen in popular culture when it comes to something that is being highlighted is I've only seen in popular culture. There's probably many other variations of the idea, but in one of the Superman movies, Superman in his form is interacting with the consciousness of his father. So his father has passed away, but Superman is still able to interact with the consciousness of his father, and it's a very kind of it's a conversation in real time, and Superman is kind of posing questions, and the consciousness of his father is actually responding back, even though that consciousness does not exist in a flesh and blood body, but there is a representation of that consciousness. And however the conversation is evolving, the consciousness on the other side is actually responding back exactly as his original father would. So it's a very complex, obviously, question of the psychological continuity, wrapping one's mind around a problem, wrangling with that problem, coming to certain conclusions, and a combination of all those things plus makes you you. So, to the best of my knowledge today, obviously we don't have the ability to be able to back up consciousness. It's the question of backing consciousness, and then there's that question of backing consciousness in a form that would make it functional, so to speak, as in like you're able to interact with it. So if everything is information at the end of the day, then I think there's two kinds of, I don't know if we should classify it as two kinds of information. Information is just information. But I guess there is something about just information as it is versus information that's able to, I guess, perhaps make a copy of itself. And I think there's perhaps something in the middle. So information, the way it is, would just be, well, everything around you. Everything is information, is a representation of the atomic structures in some kind of object. Data is also information, obviously. So is everything data? So it's a good question. It kind of takes the conversation into other realms about the nature of reality and whatnot. But life itself is a mechanism for information to be able to make copies of itself. So life does that with the transportation of its own genetic code into something else. You know, it used to be asexual reproduction billions of years ago. Then with, I think, the switch to the eukaryotic life form, the production or life started evolving via sexual reproduction, at least on in an earthly construct, and that's as much as we know. So what I'm thinking is perhaps there's something going out of that kind of conversations, or perhaps there's something in the middle, or like somewhere along the spectrum, where it's like a live representation of information in a way which allows us, whoops, I hope my video is still, oh yeah, my computer just went to sleep, but the video is still going on. It's like a live representation of information or knowledge, really, in a way that allows us to interact with it on a real-time basis. So you'd have to start going deeper into how information is structured and classified, and how knowledge is structured and classified. And once you do that, then you kind of build the models on top. And that's a very interesting conversation, because it goes to where we have to unravel the hard problem of, I think, what is consciousness. Starting with cognitive systems and branching it off and talking about some of the other kind of answers coming out of the questions, some of the other questions I pose, such as like the wrapping your mind, how somebody would wrap their mind around a problem, and then you got to kind of go back and define what makes you. And I kind of made a separate video about that, and that's just peering into that subject. Versus how somebody wrapping their mind around a problem, how that's kind of different versus somebody else wrapping their mind around a problem, because there's something unique about how an individual wraps their mind around a problem, in addition to the fact how they've accumulated a certain amount of knowledge, and the combination of the two, at the very least, leads to a reality that the way they perceive a problem or the structure of some construct or reality is different versus somebody else. That's really what separates, Ray Kurzweil or Einstein, or Ted Nelson. I was just watching some of his work, or Richard Feynman, or anyone, Madame Curie, anyone really, Grace Hopper, anyone. Like it's the way these minds or brains wrangle with a problem or something is different versus something else. So I don't know like what the answer is. I don't know if it's based on just the connectome. Richard Feynman was of the opinion that who we are is simply a matter of how the atoms are positioned in the brain. So Sebastian Sung's kind of book, I haven't finished that book, but like the, the the nature of the connectome and whether it actually results in the perception and other things being a certain way, that's one thing. There could be a genetic component to it with how the genetic structure itself, along with the microbiota plus combination of things like wet-wear connectome, how that kind of leads to an individual perhaps being different in some sense. There's a couple other kind of theories that kind of outline intelligence. I don't think should be the only mechanism by which we measure how a mind is structured, because it's a very linear construct in order to be able to ascertain how minds wrap their how a mind wraps itself around a construct, a problem, a reality. So that's another conversation in respect to the kind of systems and mechanisms we create in order to be able to ascertain intelligence. I think it could be very limited because without actually having an understanding of what's going on in an individual mind or brain, and two, how that could be useful in a future sense, we have no idea, or I don't think we should be quick in kind of classifying something as inherently sitting on some scale or versus another. But generally, when it comes to intelligence, it is, I believe, I could be wrong, accepted that the ability to be able to absorb glucose in the brain is, I think, directly correlated with the ability to be able to solve problems, which leads to the question of what is a problem. It's a good question because I think it's open to your interpretation, and then it also leads to a question of what's computation, and there doesn't seem to be a very clear-cut answer to what should be considered computation. It's just not the switching and coming up with a binary output. You can look into this. I don't think there is a clear definition of what is considered to be computation. So going back to the question of how to ensure psychological continuity, I think it's a very important question. For an individual, I would say the thing that would matter the most, I think the problem of replicating like the physical self, I personally suspect that's a problem that will be solved in the next couple of decades. It's a problem of computation. There are errors when it comes to copying the genetic information over, and I think there's a couple of ways in order to be able to, at least there's always two ways, nuance and brute force, in order to be able to overcome such problems, some computational problems. And I think with better computational systems and the further mechanisms through which technologies will be improved, that problem will be solved. So then if the problem of physical continuity has been solved, then how do we kind of go about demystifying the mechanism through which psychological or cognitive continuity can be had? So that's the more complex and interesting question. Based on the very limited amount of information or research that I've conducted, there doesn't seem to be any kind of clear-cut answers when it comes to how a unit of consciousness can actually be stored, whether it's a combination of a meme and a beam. Beam is like a unit of consciousness. I don't know how to actually represent it, and if it can be represented, how, in effect, those beams, B-E-E, DEMES can in effect be categorized in something that looks close to what would be considered as a MIND file, and then we have a choice to store it how we deem fit. So again, like it's a very fascinating question when it comes to this storage of the consciousness. Obviously, there's ethical and moral considerations to be made when it comes to the enablement of such a construct. Kind of use the example in a lot of respects that Carl Sagan once said that in order to be able to create an apple pie, you have to make a universe from scratch. And I think I think made this comment at some point. I think at Singularity Hub in one of their comment section where I said that I don't think it's ethical to create a conscious life form and not give it a universe that it could expand into. So I'm not saying that we have to create a universe in order to be able to usher a construct through which a conscious life form could evolve into or would evolve into. But I think it's only fair that a conscious life form or entity is that it evolves in a reality through which it could continually evolve, where it would continually evolve into by demystifying secrets and unraveling realities, just to kind of through a mechanism through which it could constantly evolve and update. And that would be like, I think, the utopian kind of reality for any conscious life form. I think that would be the ethical and moral thing to do. Anything lesser than that would be a reality through which we can ensure that the models through which that conscious life form evolves, that its surroundings are, to the best of our knowledge and abilities, enough for it to be able to be like content and continually continually content in that space, and perhaps it can expand that space as well as it deemed fit, because at the end of the day there would just be computation, and I don't think with further breakthroughs in computation as well, perhaps there will be further breakthroughs in things like reverse computing or through quantum computing using very, very low amounts of energy. We could create many different worlds in virtual settings. That to me kind of sounds like the most plausible construct when it comes to the evolution of some of these conscious forms. How would that, like, there will be enormous benefits for us when it comes to the creation or enablement of these conscious entities, backup of consciousness, conscious entities on their own. There will potentially be merger of consciousness. You could take a little bit of, I don't know, let's use an example from today. Say we backed up, whose brain should we back up? Say we backed up Ray Kurzweil's brain and married part of Ray Kurzweil's consciousness or his mind with I don't know if you have data from like the 50s or 60s in terms of I'm thinking of in terms of mind file and not just a map of the brain. I'm actually going down where we have to go down to a level of consciousness as best as we can represent it. And so if you have say part of Ray Kurzweil's mind, and then you have part of like a physicist's mind, and then you have a neuro kind of neuroscientist and a biologist, computational biology or biologist. The combination of these plus maybe a philosopher, then we could create like a new mind in a new surrounding or construct, and that would be a new conscious life form, which would be derived from a little bit of each consciousness, perhaps the best of, or different points of view of how to wrap the mind. And by doing this, we will usher a new conscious life form, which may help us with things like trying to unravel how to think about the questions of well, it would kind of be like a super intelligence at that point. So we could put it to work, like trying to figure out some of the bigger questions in terms of, I don't know, Alan Guth's research of creating universes in the lab, which is mathematically possible based on what I know, and think of like the not just like how the research would go about, and perhaps coming up with breakthroughs how to actually observe the inner workings of that universe, because once we create it, we don't have a mechanism to observe it. To many other complex like problems, we could just put it to work. That's just two of the many questions. We could put it to work when it comes to the making of the interstellar arcs or ships, not arc, but generational ships, or steps to the singularity. There's a lot of problems to be considered, changes to be made, and we could put these intelligences or combination of conscious forms to work, and many other things like that. But it goes back to the fundamental question of what is like how do you do that? And I think there's a lot of research happening across the world. It seems like very distributed, and there's a lot of diverse activity happening in terms of trying to unravel how the not just the brain, how does the brain function, but also the mind with the different models, hierarchies, and the collection of network with cells encoded within, memories encoded within cells, and the interlinks between them, how it actually powers consciousness here in kind of like a Jeff Hawkins sense. It is from memories that we associate the patterns from which consciousness arises. It's like one of my absolute favorite quotes. It's such a powerful insight. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. But I think what's needed is to kind of merge these research somehow to be able to get to the kind of reality that I have envisioned. And then one of the outputs of something like this would be to, it's going back to the thing that I really started with, to have that psychological or cognitive continuity where in an ethical way we will give everyone a chance to back up their consciousness. And so if somebody, and there's like, it opens up another set of questions, because we're potentially looking at indefinite lifespans, because if the body can be replicated, then and you can replicate the mind, then you can potentially live forever. It's like Ray Kurzweil would say, live long enough, you can live forever. It's like, I think the title of the book was Transcendence. I haven't read the whole book, but it's just kind of so. So now you have a backup of your consciousness, and you can choose to live in a virtual world or the real world. How that can happen 20, 30 years out, I can hypothesize. I wouldn't exactly know. Nobody can predict the future that far out. At least I can't. But you'd have the backup of the consciousness, and you would, for a flesh and blood human being or any other conscious entity, would interact with that consciousness like you would interact with anybody else. We're already taking the baby steps in order to be able to get to that reality with like how knowledge is represented today in software, and with the rise of cognitive computing plus many advances that have been made. Ontology is a subject that our species have been kind of thinking about and developing for quite some time. I think it definitely goes back to Rene Descartes. I don't know if it goes all the way back to the Greek civilization, but it's like the structured representation of knowledge in a way that allows a logical entity to be able to deduce meaning out of whatever is represented through any means, through any perceptual ability. So machines are able to do that today, and they're getting increasingly better as more and more time passes by. Machines today can read, they can understand what they're reading, they can see through machine vision and make sense out of what they're seeing, and then so read, see, what else? Here, I don't know much about. I think that's also true because algorithms are being used to sift through a lot of data and make rational sense out of it. So, I mean, you can argue that it's not really seeing or hearing and reading and then understanding. You could argue it's different from how a human would wrap its mind around. But, I mean, how is that different versus what we do? Because everyone looks at data or information differently, and we perceive, we have a different perception of what we are experiencing or observing, which is predicated based on, I think it's called frames, or frame is kind of like a catchphrase for a combination of a sum total of our subjective experiences, which would include things like, our biases as well as our desires, our point of view about reality, the world, where the world is going, where our consciousness is going. Some call it the soul. So we have this bias filter. We have these. I think Einstein said common sense is a collection of biases acquired by the age 18 or 22, one or the other, something like that. And yeah, it's these are all interesting questions. So I was talking about so how somebody wraps their mind around a problem is different. Everyone absorbs information differently, but for us as humans to say that the machines are not in a position to be able to do what they're doing, it's not a very articulate or valid statement to make, because if that's not happening, then how does the construct really do the job that it's doing? So right now it's like all happening in distributed fashion. At some point, these different abilities will merge. The inherent mechanism through which the decision-making ability is improved. I think that started with the evolution of neural nets. And going back to one of the quotes by Marvin Minsky, I haven't read any of his books, but that's on my list. But one of the things he said is there's nothing we have given to the neural nets that they haven't been able to solve. And today, like machine learning has evolved to a stage whereby the more data you feed to a machine learning construct, the better it gets. And so all the things I mentioned earlier on in terms of the different aspects of how a mind actually wraps how a mind wraps itself around a problem, which is predicated upon a couple of different phenomena which we're trying to decipher. Perhaps with the miniaturization and a couple other developments, we could brute force our way towards getting to the answers that kind of form that underpinning. So perhaps the backing up of the consciousness is not like some super far-fetched kind of a phenomenon that will happen in some really far-out, distant future, like close to the singularity, whenever the technological singularity happens to be anywhere from 20, 30 to 200 years based on different projections. But we could start taking concrete steps towards making sure that consciousness gets backed up. Then I sincerely believe that pushing the mechanism through which advanced computation systems are developed will be not just absolutely useful, but crucial and necessary when it comes to the evolution of our species and our consciousness. And so with the breakthroughs in the computational systems, we will then have the means and capabilities of not just measuring our reality in all of its distinct and detailed ways, but also come up with models through which we could project futures. I mean, not everything could be projected, but with developing models, we'll have a pretty good model of a lot of different things, all the way from projecting, starting with the basics like global supply and demand to how those type of cycles will be tied with the maturation of industries that will be required from the perspective of finding continual efficiencies in the system, to just like the global route of the fleet of autonomous like drones and self-driving cars, and global supply chain system, to outer space opening up and kind of controlling that aspect, perhaps inner space, many other things. These systems will not just give us that measure and ability, but there's going to be different layers of reality or computational systems and then realities. Computational systems here in a recent sense, I've heard him talk about this. This is not my idea. None of these are my ideas. Just trying to put them together. But Mark and Recent kind of envisions this reality whereby there's different computational systems. So we've got a layer upon a layer upon a layer. It's however you want. Like, it's not however you want to go. It's got to do with the evolution of different technologies. So it's the computational layer with the internet and TCP/IP forming that layer. Then you could have IoT as part of that, Internet of Things. Then you could have virtual reality evolving in a very diverse way, in 10 to 15 years of a time. Augmented reality, holograms, a combination of these and more. So this is like computational systems driving these realities, and then obviously with the many worlds that will emerge within each one of these constructs and the combination of. If you question that, just go back to the 80s when we started with Pong. Fast forward, 20, 30 years out, 35 plus years out, and video games are looking pretty close to reality. And the same will happen with virtual worlds, where they are beginning to mimic, or getting pretty close to, because it's just a continuation of whatever happened in the game world. But I think in maybe maximum 6 years, I think virtual worlds and game worlds will be indistinguishable from the real world. There's a computation problem, right? Being able to render in more and more precise detail, as long as more computation is available, that can be powered. So then, like, if these worlds exist and we can do this in a sustainable way, I don't know how that's going to happen. It's hypothesized that some technologies can actually get us quite a lot of computation with very low amounts of energy invested. Like, we're looking at, even radical is not the word, even exponential is not the word. We're looking at some amazing efficiencies. And like mind-boggling efficiencies, like all the computation in the world, including all the things I mentioned, which today requires lots and lots of data center usage and lots of energy could all be crunched to a very tiny sphere, and that would have the ability to be able to drive all these realities. So with the computational problem being solved, these realities can be conjured or manifested, and then those sentient beings that we're talking about, like the life forms, the backup of the consciousness, could either inhabit one of those worlds, or this world, or perhaps some other world. I'm not even going to get into the question of portals, and I've had some interesting conversation about elements on the periodic table, which could allow us to potentially open up portals to another dimension by opening up a hole in the fabric of space-time and stretching it out. Stephen Hawking kind of talks about it too, like you can stretch a quantum foam and connect it to another part of the galaxy or the universe, and it's kind of bending space-time. I don't understand that. I just understand the concept. I don't know how that works, so I'm not going to talk about that. So I'm not getting in that conversation. But these realities will be possible soon, I think. But it is the hard question of the unit of consciousness is an important question. How to unravel that? I think we need more investments in that domain, in that arena. It comes down to this. I'm so excited about a reality. I mean, this is what I was thinking. So I just sent an email to an individual by the name of Ted Nelson, who is a pretty famous individual, like Project Xanadu, and like Zigzag's pretty interesting. He's a very fascinating guy. I kind of first heard about him 2 years ago via Patrick McRae's book, The Visioneers. So I sent him an email because I had a question. So this is what I was thinking. This is an idea. And so right now, if we have a question, then we have to reach out directly to that individual. Now, there is a cognitive cost when it comes to somebody reaching out to somebody, which is predicated upon the reality that there's constraints when it comes to time and, well, not so much space, but time. Because that conscious entity can only interact with so many other conscious entities in a finite time frame, and based on the other goals and objectives that conscious entity has set for itself, has to be prioritized, right? Because, well, needs and goals and prioritizing what is and what is not useful. But what if you could back up your consciousness, and then you could have multiple copies of that backup, and then there was some construct through which we could, like everybody else, could interact with a backup of that consciousness without actually kind of impacting, I guess, or influencing the original conscious entity in any shape or form. So I haven't talked about this too much. Like I just kind of mentioned, I made that short video about kind of hypothesizing. Somebody made a backup of Buckminster Fuller or Bucky's consciousness, and this lady is interacting with it. But I mean, just kind of imagine, like, instead of me actually sending an email to Ted Nelson or Ray Kurzweil or anyone else at that, I would either, like, I could interact with them through a medium, and it would, I could just get the answers that I want without any kind of cognitive computation being taken from the original source. So it's going to be like kind of like a snapshot in time, and individual original consciousness could choose to back up. It's like kind of like a snapshot in time, just like you have snapshots for, I don't know, your Mac with Time Machine or Virtual Machine snapshots of that or anything like that. I'm not equating consciousness to a virtual machine or your Mac, but I am saying that what if we could interact with the backup of a consciousness. I mean, imagine what that would do for collaboration. I would, unless there's like a military or intelligence kind of, or I don't know, national security considerations when it comes to certain portions of somebody's mind not being accessible, I'm pretty sure most people would be able to, I think would be okay with sharing portions of their mind out with the general public, which is another interesting question, because to the best of our knowledge and abilities, knowledge is not structured in that respect in specific neurons or cells. Actually, it's distributed. I don't know what it's going to take to be able to get to that level, perhaps some advanced quantum computing, to be able to decipher, well, this subject matter, that's how you wrap your mind around, is stored in this group of cells, and the combination of that, kind of back it up to that conscious form, and then back it up and upload it to the construct, some construct, whereby others could come and interact with that conscious form. But there's huge kind of advantages when it comes to the development of this construct, because this solves so many problems, so many crucial problems, from Newton to the Greek philosophers, to Einstein, to Richard Feynman, to, I mean, the list is long. We have now, could have the potential, I don't know if you can go back that far back, but like going forward, we would have a mechanism in order to be able to have conversations with individuals who originated at some point in time, and they're still originating, or there's still psychological continuity for potentially indefinite amount of time, which again opens up ethical questions related to, like, conscious entities should have the means and mechanism in order to be able to make their own choices, but at the end of the day, it's a pattern, and if it's just it's a mechanism through which the pattern can continue in potential perpetuity, which would be predetermined on how long the universe itself can continue for, then that conscious entity would remain. So, it was just like the question of backing up the consciousness is really what got me asking all these questions. I figured I'd take some time to document my thoughts. Again, I'm not the first to hypothesize a reality by which consciousness can be backed up, will be backed up, but it's a very, very interesting question. There's a bunch of ways that could come about. I've already shared some examples. There's also this concept of brain preservation. That's one way of kind of ensuring I think there's many different ways of ensuring psychological continuity, but it does go back to I think the nuanced way is to figure out what exactly constitutes as a unit of consciousness, and then figuring out a way to be able to kind of backing that up without any errors, and then when we do that, then we can replicate that information how we deem fit. So obviously, when it comes to any potential reality, there can be different applications of such a construct. So, I guess somebody would talk to Nick Bostrom when it comes to trying to figure out how such a development can pose an existential or any risk of that. Sure, something like this can be used for bad purposes. Like Ray Kurzweil would say, technology is a double-edged sword. So, somebody could use it for bad purposes. So, but over a longer period of time, considering that I don't know, a million years ago, we were living in caves and eating berries, and perhaps some good things were happening, but a lot of bad things were also happening. And then from there till almost for a million years, the average life expectancy was only 37 years, and there was disease and infant mortality, and violence was still pretty high, and all these issues of rights and freedoms and liberties or lack thereof, and less resources to go by. I think we've done pretty well, specifically in the past 85 years or so, or ever since the Great Depression. A lot of research is pointing towards that reality with Steven Pinker's work and Abundance, written by Peter Diamandis, and the references to the research that he's done. I think that is a testament to the fact that humans have continually done a much better job of capitalizing upon the insights and managing the risks at the same time. And I had this long conversation with an individual by the name of Tony Reno, where I finally came to the agreement that we must not place the risks first, because if we do that, then it impedes all potentially most technological and scientific development. Because that is the measure, that is the lens through which we measure any outcome, which by virtue of the design that we're leveraging will stunt growth and put us in one path or another. Most probably towards the development of that technology will be stunted, because the outcome will be, well, this technology should not be developed or cannot be developed because of X, Y, Z. So I don't want to close on that note, but the backing up of the consciousness in order to be able to replicate, duplicate, merge, and ensure the continuity of the psychological or cognitive continuity of that consciousness can be had is a very fascinating question. Again, many have dreamt or have had this idea that this should be done up until the 80s when Steve Jobs was talking about it, or up until the 90s when John Archibald Wheeler was talking about it. I think it was still a idea, but today we're taking a very intricate and diverse set of activities are happening that could, in effect, make this a reality. I would love this construct. I would be backing up my consciousness and then leaving instructions on a daily basis for my consciousness to interact with a lot of different consciousness. And who's to say what's going to come out of that? There is that ethical question of, if you back up your consciousness, again, if you want to create a universe from scratch, if you want to create an apple pie from scratch, first you must create a universe. And going back to the comment I made, that if we do create a conscious life form, then we have to grant it its inalienable rights. So it's going to be able to do a lot of things on our behalf, but we should ensure that it has enough room and time in order to be able to evolve in a way that makes it completely content and happy. And we shouldn't force that by design, by, chemically altering the neurosubstrate in order to ensure that happy chemicals are going into this being's mind, because that, again, would be unethical. We just got to have it evolve in a way that makes it happy based on its own choosing. Which kind of reminds me of a book I read. It's called Virtually Human, written by Martine Rothblatt. And Martine gets into a lot of details when it comes to not just potentially how the mind files could function, but also she goes in a lot of details from a ethical, even legislative, moral kind of perspective of how we will be dealing with conscious life forms, and how it is very important that we do this right and we grant these beings their inalienable rights. She did kind of mention that once this happens, that this could be a bigger issue um, compared to equal marriage rights. So I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be or not. There's going to be a lot of changes we'll have to deal with. I think already those kind of conversations are coming up with certain predictions being made by Oxford University. So that's another angle of it. I think we're going towards some reality. I don't know what it is. I think technological singularity is a way of defining that reality. I suspect that it will happen. I've looked at this for a couple of years now. And so as we take the steps towards singularity, the emergence of non-biological, if you want to call it, consciousness is going to be an increasingly important conversation. And it's going to happen, and we'll have to adapt our systems. I've kind of tried to draw a lot of attention towards not just the subject of technological singularity itself, but also the question or the research as done by individuals like Niels J. Nielsen and many others. So that's another conversation of how the non-biological sentient life form will emerge, and Nielsen said we'll debate about this for almost a decade, and then we'll be making the necessary adjustments. The adjustments are going to require multi-generational effort, and I don't want to talk about what I hypothesize could happen next. I think it's going to sit on a spectrum that will be predicated upon what you attract, and that will be predicated upon, I think, who you are and what your values are and what you've done in your life. And so I'm not going to get back on, but we should think about these things, and there's enormous benefits to be had. I encourage anyone who's actually seen this video to do your own research and look at it from an open mind and form your own conclusions. Enormous benefits to be had. Unbelievable insights can be generated. Technological change can be expedited. A great reality can be powered for all conscious life forms, and we could be looking at things like the reversal of aging, if not indefinite life extension, eradication of disease, abundance, which I mentioned, of all sorts for all, plus many other things. That's just the start. And that's just the start. All of these things that have confounded us for millions of years, that's just the start. So, this is just a kind of wrap up of started with the question of the nature of consciousness and backing it up. I'm just to start with, I'm just interested in just having conversations with people I really look up to and want to learn from based on the goals I've set for myself. And almost all of these individuals are pressed for time. I can't say I hear or do not hear back from them. Depends on how politely you ask and the actual length of the email you send. But it's a fascinating question of interacting with consciousness outside the bounds of time. And I'll just leave it at that. If you did watch the whole thing, thank you for watching. I would love to hear your feedback. If you were also interested in questions related to, like trying to think about the very nature of consciousness, technological singularity, computation driving cognition, driving consciousness, the evolution of these developments, ethical, moral considerations that we need to make, by which all conscious life forms will be not just granted their inalienable rights, but they would exist in environments that are ideally suited for their continual evolution, which means that there has to be some complexity programmed into it. I have no idea how you're going to do that. We have to talk to Alan Guth or an individual of that scale or caliber. So yeah, a lot of questions along that. So I'm just going to end this video because I got to go back and do work. But thanks for watching, and see you later.